My name is Emily Carter and for a long time I wished to erase it from the memory of anyone who had ever heard of me. I wasn't just someone who made bad decisions. I transformed myself into something no child imagines becoming one day. I was a contract killer. A woman trained to kill with coldness, efficiency, and absolute silence. The kind of person who doesn't cry, doesn't hesitate, doesn't think twice before taking a life. The kind of person who looks into the eyes of someone about to die and feels no compassion, remorse, or regret. The kind of person who believes she will never be held accountable for anything until the day everything is revealed. I used to say my heart was made of stone, but today I know that at least one stone exists. My heart was dead, completely dead, even while my body breathed. Every contract I accepted seemed like just a number, a task, a negotiation like any other. That's how I justified it. That's how I numbed everything. I repeated to myself that I only did what was necessary to survive. But that phrase became the most dangerous lie I've ever told. My life became a cycle of shadows that I myself chose. I walked through alleys, got into cars that no one should get into, made deals with people who sold their own souls, and didn't care about the price. And, without realizing it, I sold mine too. But at that time, I still thought I was in control, that nothing could touch me, that my name would never be associated with the fear I caused in others. What I didn't know is that death doesn't only arrive when the body falls. Sometimes it observes in silence, waiting for the exact moment to reveal who we truly are. And when that moment came for me, I discovered that nobody can fool heaven. Before continuing this story, I need to ask you something simple but important. If this beginning has already moved you, if it has made you reflect on choices, paths, and consequences, subscribe to the channel and leave your like. This helps me continue, bringing real testimonies that confront us, transform us, and reveal truths that many avoid hearing. Let's follow this revelation together. When I look back and try to understand at what point the darkness began to feel comfortable to me, I realize that the life I called power was never more than a carefully constructed illusion to hide the growing emptiness within my soul. I used to believe that living as a feared, respected professional, hired for the coldness with which I carried out each mission, was a kind of privilege reserved only for the strongest. In my mind, that meant I was above the rules governing the lives of ordinary people, as if I had found a shortcut to escape the frailties that are part of human existence. However, this supposedly advantageous path was, in fact, a labyrinth where the further I advanced, the less I found myself. Money seemed like the answer to everything. It arrived in quick, silent, dirty amounts, deposited in envelopes that carried the weight of lives I would never know beyond the final instant I myself provoked. The adrenaline, which many describe as something fleeting, became a devastating addiction for me, fueling the feeling of being in absolute control of the world around me. I walked among people who didn't even imagine who I was, and this feeling of anonymity mixed with power made me believe that nothing could stop me, that what I did would have no consequences, that no one's fate, including my own, would be affected by my lack of compassion. Over the years, the atmosphere of crime began to shape my mind in ways I could no longer clearly perceive. The weapons, which had once trembled slightly in my hands on early missions, became natural extensions of my body. The vehicles I used to escape seemed like corridors leading me deeper and deeper into an abyss I insisted on ignoring. The people who hired me spoke little, but looked a lot, as if they saw in me something I didn't even see myself, someone who had already lost everything and didn't know how to acknowledge their own loss. What I didn't realize was that every feeling of power I experienced was actually distancing me from the only place where the soul finds rest. And when I finally realized this, I was already too trapped to leave on my own, unaware that the fall that would follow would reveal the true door I myself had unknowingly opened. The truth is, there's always a first step before someone is completely lost, but almost no one notices when it happens, because evil rarely comes with a shout. It usually presents itself with a whisper, offering a quick fix, momentary relief, a promise that nothing will change afterward. I still remember with painful clarity the first time I agreed to take a life. I had no idea that that seemingly controlled and cold instant would be the spark that would ignite my entire consciousness. opening within me a space where darkness would find permanent dwelling. When I received my first contract, my hands were discreetly sweating, and although I tried to appear calm, there was a part of me that begged to give up while another, much stronger part repeated that this would only be a one-time thing, and that I could back out whenever I wanted. This kind of lie is seductive because it gives the impression that there is still a limit, an internal break, a boundary that will never be crossed. However, the moment I pulled the trigger and saw the life of a stranger extinguish before my eyes, something inside me fell asleep, while something completely different awoke. A silent presence that told me I had finally discovered my purpose, when in reality I had been hooked by sin in such a subtle way that I didn't even realize how spiritually vulnerable I had become. What I felt that night wasn't regret, it was power. And that was the first sign that something was deeply wrong, but I was too blind to understand. The lack of remorse, which should have frightened me, became fuel for me to move forward with. More coldness than I ever imagined I was capable of. Sin, when not confronted, not only grows, it dominates, molds, numbs, corrodes. If I had known that that exact moment would open a door leading my soul directly into a darkness far greater than any crime I could commit in life, perhaps I would have made different choices. However, the truth is that evil found a place within me before I even realized something was trying to possess me completely. As the months passed, and after the first contracts were executed, I realized that something far more dangerous than the weapons I carried was beginning to develop within me. An absolute indifference to the pain of others. A detachment so profound from human empathy that I could no longer recognize my own reactions. Each life taken should have left its mark. But instead of wounds, what formed was a layer of ice that slowly spread throughout my interior, rendering me incapable of feeling anything even remotely human. I grew accustomed to looking at people's faces as if they were merely part of a temporary backdrop, as if they had no stories, families, dreams, or future, because admitting that would require confronting the truth about who I was becoming. This indifference didn't appear suddenly. It grew like poison poured drop by drop, transforming my mind into a place where evil seemed justifiable, and where every memory that could awaken regret was buried under a mixture of pride and emotional self-defense. I told myself that life is hard and that everyone needs to deal with their own destiny, as if that absolved me from the fact that I myself was deciding the fate of others without any right to do so. Evil, when not confronted, creates a kind of spiritual blindness that renders the aggressor incapable of seeing the abyss that opens right before their feet. I began to live in a state where death didn't shock me, pain didn't affect me, and guilt didn't reach me. With each completed mission, my heart grew heavier and, at the same time, more distant from any possibility of change. It was as if I were building my own inner prison, a prison where coldness was celebrated as strength, and where the ability to hurt someone was seen as proof that I was still in control, when in reality, I had already completely lost control over my own soul. What I didn't know was that this silent process of dehumanization was preparing the ground for the moment that would change everything, the moment when destiny itself would surround me in a way I would never forget. That day began like so many others, marked by a constant sense of alert that had become a natural part of my body, as if my muscles had been trained to live in a state of permanent war. I received a new contract, a name written on a piece of paper that, to me, meant just another sum to be deposited, another step in a routine I already performed almost mechanically. However, something that night felt different, and although I didn't want to admit it, a silent unease insisted on running down my spine, as if trying to warn me that something deeper was lurking. Even so, as I always did, I ignored this premonition, believing that the invincibility I possessed was stronger than any spiritual sign that tried to reach me. When I arrived at the scene, the street was emptier than usual, and the wind carried a kind of chill that didn't just come from the weather, but from something moving in the air like an invisible presence, announcing that the end was closer than I could understand at that moment. I took a few steps with the gun hidden inside my coat, and before I could even identify the target, I heard a dry crack that didn't seem to belong to the world around me, but rather to the space that opened up inside my chest when the bullet pierced my body. The pain wasn't the scariest part. The real terror came in the form of the realization that I no longer had control over absolutely anything. My body fell as if it were too heavy to continue, sustaining the life I had tried to preserve through force and violence. And as I felt the blood spreading across the floor, a strange feeling of separation began to take hold of me. Everything around me began to fade, as if the world were being swallowed by a silence that did not belong to Earth. And in that void, I realized that death is not just an interruption, but a revelation of what has always been hidden. I just never imagined that upon crossing that border, I would discover something that would forever change everything I believed about life, death, and eternity. When silence filled the place and darkness began to envelop everything around me, I thought I was simply losing consciousness. But within seconds, I realized that something much stranger was happening. Something that didn't resemble fainting, unconsciousness, or a dream at all. It was as if my body had become just a distant object, an empty form that no longer belonged to me, while a version of myself, fully awake and lucid, began to emerge from within that last breath of life. The sensation wasn't one of physical movement, but of detachment, as if I were being unwrapped layer by layer, until the most intimate and true part of me separated from everything I had previously believed to be real. I found myself lying on the ground, and the sight of my own body, inert, pale, and expressionless, awakened a terror I had never felt, not even in the most dangerous moments of my life of crime. I tried to touch myself. I tried to raise my arms. I tried to scream my name. But none of these reactions brought about any change in what was before me. My hand pierced my own skin as if I were made of wind, and the sound of my voice dissipated into the air as if the atmosphere around me had lost its ability to sustain any noise. The powerlessness that overwhelmed me at that moment was devastating, because for the first time I understood that there was nothing left that I could control, manipulate, or resolve. As I watched the scene, a kind of mist began to move around me, as if space were being distorted by something I couldn't comprehend, and that mist seemed to slowly pull the environment away, blurring everything, making it disfigured and strange. It was as if I were being pushed into a place where logic didn't exist, a place that no longer belonged to the world of the living. I heard footsteps, not physical footsteps, but a kind of presence walking towards me, bringing with it a light that wasn't of this earth and a silence that wasn't human. I still didn't know who was approaching, but something inside me told me that what happened next would define my eternal destiny. As that presence drew closer, the mist around me seemed to bend, as if recognizing an authority that surpassed all human understanding. And in that same instant, my spirit was seized by a mixture of fear, fragility, and such an intense awareness of my own existence that I felt as if I were being dismantled from within. The light coming towards me was not like the light we see in the physical world. It didn't just shine in my eyes, it penetrated all the places where I once hid my guilt, my fears, my choices, and my shadows. The closer this light came, the more I realized there was nowhere to hide, because it penetrated everything, including that which I seemed to have forgotten. When he finally appeared before me, I understood, without anyone needing to explain, that I was standing before Jesus. Not the romantic Jesus of paintings, nor the meek Jesus often portrayed as incapable of expressing justice, but the real Jesus, the one who carries within himself the fullness of love, and at the same time the fullness of truth, the kind of presence that silences any attempt at justification, because everything within us becomes completely visible before him. There were no words of accusation, no long speeches, no need to remind me of what I had done, because as soon as my eyes met his, my spirit bowed in a silent confession that no human being could ever wrest from me. Jesus didn't raise his voice, didn't lift his hand, didn't show hatred or contempt. He simply looked at me, and that look contained such overwhelming clarity that it exposed the truth of all the lives I had taken, of all the choices I had made, of every door I had opened to darkness while believing that nothing could harm me. The most impressive thing is that I felt in that instant that he knew every detail of my past long before I was aware of what I was becoming, and yet he remained before me with a firmness that was, at the same time, just and profoundly holy. I understood that I wasn't being judged by words, but by the essence of who I had become, and this revelation opened up something before me that I never imagined I would see. When Jesus' gaze pierced everything I had hidden for so many years, a kind of spiritual curtain began to open before me, revealing a place that could not be explained with any human language. Because it was not merely a setting, but a living consequence, shaped by the choices of each soul that decided to turn away from the truth. The light around him receded just enough for me to see what lay beyond, and in that instant I understood that he was not taking me to a place prepared by him, but to a place that I myself had built, with each act of cruelty, each life taken, each hardening of heart, each justification I gave to remain immersed in evil. What I saw was not a theatrical hell, filled with fire and grotesque creatures. What I saw was far worse, because it was the complete absence of God. A void so profound it seemed to devour any vestige of identity, hope, or meaning. The souls in that place screamed not only in pain, but in loss, in separation, in an insatiable longing, as if they were aware that something infinitely precious had been left behind forever. They walked in circles, trapped within emotional realities that reflected their own choices, and the loneliness that hung over them was so intense it seemed to have weight, texture, depth. Jesus showed me faces. They weren't unfamiliar faces, but the faces of people I had killed. Faces I had seen for only seconds before taking them from this world. Faces I never imagined seeing again in that state. Each one carried an interrupted story, a destiny I had destroyed before it could even blossom, and the pain that pierced my spirit when I realized this was greater than any physical punishment I could have received. Jesus didn't need to explain. He simply said that the harvest always comes because the spiritual universe is governed by truths that not even death can alter. And as I gazed at that place, which represented exactly where my life would lead me, something unexpected began to stir within that darkness, something I never imagined could happen to me. As I gazed at that place of utter separation, filled with faces I could never forget, something began to shift in the atmosphere, as if a gentle breeze were sweeping through a reality untouched by anything. The light emanating from Jesus, until then firm and just, began to envelop that darkness in a way that didn't diminish the truth, but revealed a possibility that I, for all I had done, never imagined I deserved. I felt my spirit tremble with a mixture of shame, fear, and a hope so fragile that I feared losing it before even understanding it. It was then that I realized that Jesus wasn't showing me my destiny merely to condemn me, but to awaken within me something I myself had buried: the capacity to recognize my own misery and desire change. When my eyes met his again, I no longer saw just the judge who reveals the truth. I saw the Redeemer who sees the essence behind the ruin, the one who knows how many times a human being tries to survive with strength they don't possess, while sinking into choices that destroy them from within. Without raising his voice, he made me understand that I could still return, not because I was worthy, but because he is merciful. The way he conveyed this truth was not through words, but through a profound impression, a certainty that settled within me with a clarity that pierced through all the despair I carried. In an instant, I felt as if I were being pulled upward, not physically, but spiritually, as if existence itself was being reinstated within the body I had left. The darkness began to fade and the light grew more intense until, suddenly, a distant sound began to echo, a sound I recognized as human voices calling my name, trying to bring me back. When I finally opened my eyes in the hospital, I realized I had returned to life with a different weight. Not the weight of guilt that had crushed me before, but the weight of the responsibility to live in a completely new way. And it was this new burden that led me to seek out my families, to confess hidden crimes, to face consequences I feared but knew I needed to confront, because the second chance I received wasn't meant to be kept silent. It was meant to transform everything that remained of my future. After everything I've lived through, everything I've seen, and everything that was revealed to me in that brief moment between life and death, I understood that no human decision goes unnoticed in the eyes of God. Even when we believe that silence, anonymity, or emotional justification can hide the truth long enough for it to escape our notice. The journey I've traveled, marked by choices that hurt people and destroyed destinies, left deep scars that will never be completely erased, but they have become a living testament to the fact that divine mercy can reach even those who have walked for years in the opposite direction from the light. Today, when I look at my own story, I feel a mixture of shame for what I did and indescribable gratitude for the opportunity I received, because I know that few have the privilege of returning from such a deep place of darkness, carrying the chance to rebuild their own soul. This awareness, which once crushed me, now reminds me daily that grace is not an abstract concept, but a reality that manifests itself primarily where guilt seemed to be an eternal sentence. What I want you to understand is that evil never begins as something big and frightening. It is born from small, seemingly harmless decisions that slowly push us away from what God desires for our lives. I learned that when we justify our mistakes by saying, "There will be no consequences," we are opening spiritual doors that we cannot always close on our own. Each wrong choice creates almost invisible fissures that gradually transform into abysses that distance us from what we were created to be. It was only when I faced the spiritual truth hidden behind each of my decisions that I realized that nothing is truly unimportant when it comes to eternity. If there is one thing I would like you to take away from this testimony, it is that no one deceives God, because God sees the innermost being, knows every intention, observes every choice, and returns each harvest according to what we sow in secret. Death showed me a destiny that I myself built, but the life I received back showed me that there is always the possibility of change, as long as there is courage to admit the truth and allow Christ to transform what can still be saved. When I awoke from that experience, carrying in my memory scenes that would never fade, the first sensation that invaded my soul was that I was being returned to life not as a continuation of what I was, but as an invitation to begin anew. This realization was painful because it forced me to confront the depth of the damage I myself had caused, not only to others, but to every part of my own soul. However, it was also a chance to understand that God does not return us to existence to condemn us again, but to teach us to live with awareness and spiritual responsibility. Since then, each day I wake up is a silent reminder that redemption is not an isolated event. It is a continuous process that demands vigilance, humility, a willingness to abandon old shadows, and the courage to walk towards a light that reveals everything, even that which we would like to hide. If you feel you are drifting away from the light, if you realize that small choices are pushing you down paths that wound your soul, don't wait for life to push you to the limit to discover the truth that I needed to see the hard way. The greatest spiritual trap is not scandalous sin, but the deceptive comfort that convinces us we are safe while we slowly drift away from who God called us to be. God does not desire your destruction. He desires your restoration, and this restoration begins the moment you decide to look inward and admit that you need Him. True change is not born from human strength, but from sincere surrender. And if there is one thing I have learned, it is that God transforms even what we believe to be completely lost, as long as we allow Him into the areas we fear to expose. If this testimony touched you in any way, subscribe to the channel now and stay here. Every day, a new message may be exactly what God uses to speak to you. This space exists to remind people like you and me that even when we hit rock bottom, there is still a way back. And sometimes all that's missing is a word that awakens the spirit, a truth that opens our eyes, or a testimony that gives us back the courage to start again.